Well, welcome to History 408, the Civil War and Reconstruction. I'm Jean Marie Stevens. I'm really looking forward to this course with all of you. I think it's a very interesting course in the sense that we're not just going to be looking at the Civil War proper, but we're really going to be looking at what led up to the Civil War. And then we're also going to be talking about not just Reconstruction, but illustrating how the Civil War, as well as Reconstruction, had a significant effect on Americans throughout the 20th century and even today. So I hope that all of you, as you read through the books, really get a good sense of what it is that the Civil War means and what Reconstruction means for larger American history and the larger American narrative. So this week we start out with Thomas Fleming's book, A Disease in the Public Mind. And obviously this week and next we're going to be focusing on the institution of slavery. So this week we're going to talk about the origins of slavery, how it arrived in the English colonies, and then how it really evolves in terms of not just how the English colonies start to flourish, but also how slavery evolves as an institution, and what things like territorial expansion will mean for slavery. So let's get started and let's talk about the origins of slavery and where this very, very interesting institution came from. So our first couple of slides are going to be contextual, so that those of you who do not have a strong background in what Fleming is going to be talking about in his book, that you get a good sense of where we're coming from and you get a good sense of how Fleming's work actually fits into the larger narrative. So we start with the transatlantic slave trade. And the transatlantic slave trade starts in the 1600s, and it really is a byproduct of the colonial system, and the idea that multiple European powers are out there on the high seas. They're gathering natural resources, they're gathering exotic goods, and eventually they're gathering people. And these particular quote unquote commodities are going to be the things that they sell and trade throughout the rest of the world. And these are the major players here: the Portuguese, the British, French, and Dutch traders. And these are the major empires as well at this particular point in time. The Portuguese being number one, and the top of the pyramid here in terms of traders. And so for the purposes of our story, there are going to be slaves that are sold and traded throughout much of the world. But for the purposes of our story, what these slaves are used for is for the planting and the harvesting of commodity crops. And it's not just going to be in the colonies, as we're going to be talking about, but throughout the South Atlantic. So the south of North America, the Caribbean, and then the northern points and the eastern coastal points of South America. Now, there was a triangular trade system that was going on. So most slaves did not go from Africa straight to this quote unquote new world. They originally would go to Europe. Some of them would then be sent off to other areas, say like India. But what would eventually happen for many of them is that they would be sent on what's called the Middle Passage. And that passage is going to be to the South Atlantic, and particularly initially to the Caribbean. So the triangular trade is going to be from Africa to Europe to South America, the Caribbean, or the British colonies. And for our story, especially the British colonies are important, but the majority of the slaves that are going to make their way to the British colonies initially are actually going to be from the Caribbean. So in terms of this middle passage, the middle passage is again going to be where they are shipped from Europe after they've made the trek from Africa to Europe, that they are sent from Europe to the South Atlantic. And the middle passage is really this is the major thing that you think about in terms of the travel of slaves. And I have this picture on the right hand side of the screen illustrating the type of ships that these slaves were put on. And those little white pieces that you see there are actually the number of slaves that would be stacked into a particular ship. The Middle Passage, it's one of the visual experiences that I can think of in terms of the Middle Passage. It's done actually really, really well. Is a clip from Amistad, Steven Spielberg's movie, and you can actually YouTube that and watch that if you would like to. This is a treacherous passage. Being stacked in there like that on the boats really illustrates that slaves are treated as non-human, right? As non-persons. Their basic physical needs are not thought of. Using the bathroom, being able to eat, being able to even breathe in these conditions. And so it's quite illustrative of how slaves were treated. And, we obviously in the modern day understand this in terms of selling people into bondage. And obviously to us that illustrates a very inhumane thing to do, right? But in terms of people always talk about the idea of not projecting our, say now, 21st century sensibilities on this era. Well, you can say that in terms of the idea of using slaves, right? One could possibly make an argument or a justification for the use of slaves in this empirical system, right? But what you can't really justify is the way that slaves were treated. And so it really is illustrative of the fact that this institution was clearly demeaning, it dehumanized people, and it really isn't projecting 21st century sensibilities on the institution to think of it as being a very inhumane way to treat human beings. So this Middle Passage, again, like I said, is quite treacherous, and many Africans do not make it through the Middle Passage. But those that do obviously are sold into bondage, particularly in on the southern eastern seaboard in terms of our story. But what's interesting is this transatlantic slave trade that actually helped the British gain a foothold and really a stronghold in terms of the trade and European trade and the colonization of the world. That the British actually eventually in 1807 banish slavery, and it's banished throughout their empire. And so it took about 50 so years for there to be a really strong abolition movement that would be created in Britain. But when it is created, and when they create the Slave Trade Act and they ban slavery, there's a great deal of pressure on the Americans to do the same, to join, quote unquote, the civilized world by not selling people into bondage and not using them in the fields and not using them in terms of hard labor, to give people their freedoms. And it certainly is not something that the South listens to for a very long time, and actually has to be forced into the idea of getting rid of slavery, obviously via what we're going to be studying in this course, the Civil War. So recognize the fact that we have this larger transatlantic slave trade starts in about the 1600s. We have this large group of empires that are trading people, and they are selling people into bondage. They're needed for commodity crops in the area that we're going to be talking about in the course. There's this Middle Passage, and it's a very treacherous passage, and on top of it, it is a passage that treats these human beings as though they were animals, or maybe even worse than animals, right? And then we have this closing of the larger transatlantic slave trade when the British, who were at the top of the heap in terms of the imperial system by the 1800s, banned slavery throughout their own empire, and it is the largest empire at that point. So what's the United States to do, right? So let's start talking about what the slave trade meant for the English colonies and how slavery actually really flourished in the British colonies. So, as I mentioned, in terms of the British colonies, the majority of the slaves that are brought into the colonies are from the Caribbean. So, they're brought from Africa taken up to Europe. They take the Middle Passage and they go to the Caribbean, and then eventually they are sold up north into the Chesapeake region and also the Low Country, present-day North and South Carolina. Um, Again, these particular slaves are typically brought in by the Portuguese. There are some slaves that are sold into the north by the Dutch, namely in New England, but there isn't a significant need for slaves in the north. And Also in the North, they often tried to use Native Americans for slaves. It didn't work out too well, but again, there wasn't a significant need for slaves. The places where there was significant need would be in Virginia and then also the Low Country. So initially in Virginia, as we know, John Rolfe actually makes a go of it in terms of the Virginia colony, and actually helps the Virginia colony become extremely established by being able to cultivate tobacco. And in cultivating tobacco in 1619, it creates a need for slaves. And this tobacco just takes off. It's a perfect fertile soil in the Chesapeake region for tobacco. And so more and more slaves are needed. They're needed for planting, they're needed for harvesting. And so this is where we see the initial boom in terms of slavery. Significant trade is going to begin in the colonies in 1625, and it will explode in the 1680s. For those who were sold into slavery in the northern portion of the modern day South, so in the Chesapeake region, these are the slaves that, when we typically think of the narrative of slaves, these are the slaves that are highly controlled and restricted by their masters. They live very closely with their masters. Their masters are out in the fields with them, and they really aren't able to have. Now, I'm not going to use the word freedom, but they really aren't able to have any sort of a life for themselves on the plantation. It's very different in the Low Country, because even though the slaves of the Low Country obviously are in bondage as well, what happens in the rice plantations is that the European or the colonial owners aren't able to actually go out into the fields with them, because there are mosquitoes there, and the Europeans can and the Americans, those that are native to the area, will actually contract malaria from the mosquitoes, whereas Africans were immune to this. And so, because of the separation between slaves and their masters, they were actually able in the Low Country to create a very significant culture for themselves on the plantations. They were able to create languages for themselves. They were able to continue to practice their own religions. And then eventually, we're going to see an intermingling of these things. So, an intermingling of European and African and American culture in these individuals. But you can see that there's a significant difference. There's a slave master that's right there all the time in terms of Virginia, and then in terms of the Low Country, you're going to see that there's a independent culture that is created there, and it's no coincidence that this is the place where some of the seeds of even the Underground Railroad sprout up, because of the fact that there is that somewhat of that separation. But make no mistake about it, both types of slaves are obviously in bondage, have no freedom, and are treated very shabbily by their masters. They are beaten, the women are raped, the women are taken in the house to be mistresses. Their children are sold into slavery. They're separated from them. And so it's just, it's an atrocious situation for people to be in, from the point of being in bondage, being in shackles, being forced to do this labor, to not have any sort of a free life, to not be able to walk off the plantation. But on top of that, they are treated like animals. And so this is where we start to see, as people, particularly in the North, start understanding the slave systems of the South, and particularly the Low Country too, that there is this significant debate that starts to rumble up about whether or not slavery should be used in America. And once you get to the Revolution in 1776, there's a significant discussion among Americans about whether there should be slavery or not. And as Fleming's going to point out to you, there's a significant discussion about this among the founding fathers. And I think he has some very interesting things to say about the founding fathers in terms of slavery. So we do have a debate that's going on in the 1600s. We'll have a debate that's going on even stronger in the 1770s. And then by the time we get into the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and as we move to the beginning of the Civil War, you will see that there's a ramping up of that discussion, and there's an abolitionist movement that occurs. And so it's really something that brews over time. So number one, recognize the fact that the initial slaves that are used in the sprouting up of slavery is going to happen in Virginia because of tobacco, and then it's going to explode in the 1680s, and that explosion is really going to come from not just the fact that tobacco has become the significant cash crop, but also that the rice plantations in the Low Country are sprouting up, and they're really making a significant profit. And so you see that America, by the time you get to 1807, when the British have banned the transatlantic slave trade, and they've banned the usage of slaves in there, or the trade of slaves within their empire, that you can really see in the Americas that they've already created for themselves such a large population of slaves that doesn't mean anything to them anymore. They're selling and trading their own slaves, and in terms of plantation owners, they're able to populate their plantations with slave families. So there's the reproduction of slaves on plantations. The thing that's very interesting about slavery in America is that even though it's used significantly in terms of tobacco and the rice plantations, and that's where we see it spring up, by the late 1700s, the use of slaves, or the proliferation of the usage of slaves, starts to dwindle. But when cotton becomes king in the South, and Eli Whitney creates the cotton gin, and he is able to create something that is able to remove seeds at about 50 pounds or so in an hour. It really is something that allows for the institution of slavery to re-blossom. And the usage of the cotton gin is going to allow for the production of more and more cotton. They'll be able to plant more, produce more, and obviously they need more labor for that. And so that's where we're going to see, as people started to think about sort of pushing slavery off to the side, in the South, this really is the point in time, the late 1700s, early 1800s, where slavery just absolutely explodes. So you see these different eras here in terms of American slavery. So let's move forward, and let's talk about some significant aspects of American history, like territorial expansion, that is really going to allow for the greater debate about slavery, and the angry debate about slavery to rupture. So territorial expansion is going to be the number one reason why we start inching toward the Civil War in the United States. Now, territorial expansion is going to be inextricably linked to slavery. When the Louisiana Purchase was completed in 1804, the idea for Thomas Jefferson in purchasing this land was to create a larger agrarian republic where farmers could spread out through the nation, and can create what it is that Jefferson believed that the United States should be, is these independent, free spirits who live off of the land, and who are able to, navigate the world of being a citizen, and also being someone who helps the United States produce, feeds the people of the United States, but also feeds their own souls in terms of Americans. That they are the epitome to him of the citizen in the United States. But what Jefferson doesn't really recognize is going to happen is that farming in the South is, in many ways, and he should have recognized this certainly in terms of his slaveholding past, is that farming in the South in the United States was inextricably linked itself to slavery. And so as Southern farmers would branch out, obviously slavery would go with it, right? So the Louisiana Purchase is really going to bring this debate on slavery and the expansion of slavery to the forefront. And there are people in the early 1800s, particularly in the North, who are talking about the idea of not just stopping the movement of slavery through the United States, but they really start thinking of it and talking about it in terms of it being an abhorrent institution. And so this idea of this abhorrent institution being able to spread through into these new areas becomes something quite frightening to people who are against slavery. But for people in the South, and particularly landholders in the South, and also people in the South, this is something that happens with territorial expansion, is that people who are small farmers are going to be able to branch out and not necessarily create large plantations for themselves, but they're going to have big enough swaths of land that they're going to be able to use more slaves, and they're going to be able to produce more because of more land and also because of more manpower, right? So in terms of the South, the expansion of the territory is clearly going to expand farming, plantation owning, and obviously then slavery. So this is the point in time, the early 1800s, where we're going to see the debate on slavery really expand. One of the things that people talk a great deal about in terms of the discussion on slavery and what slavery means for the United States is how it was dealt with in terms of the United States Constitution. So in 1787, when there was this discussion about the idea of a representative government and the idea of population numbers actually equaling the representation that you would have in the United States government, there was a significant effort by Northerners to say that blacks did not count, that blacks were property, and therefore they didn't count as a portion of the population. Now, Southerners obviously recognize this as a power play by the Northerners, and they create their own power play, which is they want for African Americans or for slaves to be treated as at least a percentage of a person so that they could be counted, and when they're put together in terms of counting up the numbers, that the Southerners would actually get, because they have a larger population in their state, that they would get a greater say within the government. And so what actually happens is a 3/5 compromise leading to the 3/5 clause in the United States Constitution that blacks, slaves, would count as 3/5 of a person in the South. Now, what's going to happen after this, and certainly after the Louisiana Purchase, as people start moving out westward, is that as each territory becomes larger and can apply to be admitted to the Union as a state, they're going to have to make the choices as to whether they're going to be a slave state or a free state. And for quite a while, there was a consistent balance in terms of whether we would have a slave state come in or a free state come in. And so by the time we get to 1820, when Missouri decides to petition to be admitted to the Union, it was completely equal in terms of the number of states that were slave states and the number of states that were free states. And Missouri was going to upset that balance because Missouri actually wanted to be admitted as a slave state. So what happens in terms of the American public, the populace, and this will start to illustrate to us a regionalism that's going to be occurring, a northern region versus a southern region. So this split, this sectionalism that we're going to talk about in terms of the Civil War. This is really going to be the point in time where we see this split happen. So the Missouri Compromise is initially talked about because of the idea that there's a real concern for Northerners of the balance of power in Congress if particular states like Missouri start to become slave states. And as we understand, the unorganized territory that's to the west and the north and northwest of Missouri is going to be a really good place to particularly create cotton farms. That there's this understanding that slavery is going to sort of be the rule of the day, right, in terms of the admittance of new states. So in terms of the Missouri Compromise, what happens is that, number one, Missouri is going to be admitted as a slave state, but that they very quickly rush through Maine at the same time, and Maine comes in as a free state, and so we have that balance that's still there. Okay, so in order to maintain the balance of power in Congress so that slave states don't get more power than free states and vice versa, they compromise on another thing, and that is that they create that 3630 line, that Missouri Compromise line, that runs out west, and all of the states that are below that line can be admitted as a southern state, and all of the states above the line have to be admitted as a free state. So everything above the northern border of what at this point is the Arkansas Territory, there is no slavery. So in this creation of this, obviously it maintains that balance of power in Congress. It maintains that the North is going to be free of slavery. It maintains that the South is going to be slave-holding states. But what it also illustrates here is that split, and you can even see it here on the map, right? That significant split between the North and the South, the free states and the slave states. And what this truly means for the United States is it's representative, it's very symbolic of the split that's going to occur in the Civil War. And so for Americans at this point in time, this is really going to heat up the debate about what slavery means for the United States. And as we see in the 1820s, the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, that there's going to be a significant turn in terms of the discussion of the morality of slavery. And it really is going to illustrate to the American public that there are two distinctly different regions in the United States, one being the North and one being the South. And obviously that's going to blow up in everybody's faces in the 1850s and then in the 1860s as we move into the Civil War. So that's what territorial expansion means in terms of slavery. So let's move forward for a bit. So there was our context, and obviously that context is going to get you through the first portion of the Fleming book. So what I try to do with these discussions is to really highlight the context, to get you guys somewhat familiar with what's going on, and then I like to highlight the main issues that I think the author for the week is really bringing up and bringing forth in his book. And so for this particular book, I want you to pay attention to some very specific things. But before I list those things, as you can see them on the screen, one thing I want you to recognize is that all of these books that you're reading for the course are skimmable. So you see 4 books in front of you and you think, oh my goodness, how am I going to get through this? And if you've opened up the Catan book on the Civil War, and the Civil War proper, talking about the actual war and the actual battles themselves. If you've looked at that and looked at the text in there, you'll see that it's a gigantic book. So you think, how am I going to get through this? Skimming. Okay, so when you go through these books, you want to make sure that you're reading the introduction of the book, and then moving forward into the first chapter, reading the introduction of that chapter, and then skimming through the first line of every paragraph and maybe the last line of every paragraph, but absolutely the first line of every paragraph, and then reading the conclusion of the chapter, and then moving on and doing that through the whole book, and then finally reading the author's conclusion. Now I would suggest for Fleming that this actually is a really easy read. It's actually one of those things where you try to skim it and you're reading it and you actually really enjoy it. He's actually a really, really good writer, and he doesn't make this stuff dry. He makes it very interesting, he makes wonderful transitions, and he also explains points. And I think that's really important. It's a very readable book. So I think you probably will read the whole book, or you won't skim through as many sections. You might skip some sections there, but you're not going to skim through as much as you think you will with Fleming. You absolutely will with Catan, and then as you move forward, you make those decisions in terms of the books. I actually think Foner's book is pretty easy to read, but it's certainly not as easy as Fleming. And then I think that McPherson's book is super easy to read, just like Fleming's. But keep your eye on skimming through, getting the main points, getting the argument that the author is making, and getting the main points that he's trying to present to you. So in terms of the Fleming book, number 1, try and figure out his main argument. You're going to have to do that in terms of the journal article, is discuss that. But for him, in these first 8 chapters that you're reading, the 4 things that I think stick out very much in terms of what he's discussing is, number one, the founding fathers and slavery. And he makes a really strong case for looking at the founding fathers as men who were kind of stuck in a very particular situation with slavery, but didn't necessarily want slaves. And like George Washington freeing his slaves. So he makes some significant discoveries, and he presents some discussions about people like Jefferson, people like Washington, that we don't really necessarily hear a lot about in the main narrative. So look at that as one of the main issues that he brings forth. Also, territorial expansion and slavery. I've talked about it. He goes into much greater depth, talks much more about the debate during the Missouri Compromise and all of that. But there's another main issue. Another issue that he talks a great deal about are the arguments for and against slavery. The morality issues here, the reasons why Southerners wanted to keep slavery, the reasons why Northerners wanted the South to get rid of slavery, and what this meant on an ethical and moral level too. And that's something he does a really good job with. And then one last thing here in these 8 chapters that I think that he brings up that's going to come up again in the Civil War is blacks and American warfare. There's been an African American serving in every American war since the Revolution. So he really brings this up in terms of the Revolution, what it means in terms of Northerners or Northern blacks and the Revolution and having freedom, and then what being a part of warfare and having a tradition of being a part of warfare means for blacks in the North and the South. And you're going to want to drag that along with you, that topic, as you move into the Civil War, because we're going to see in the Civil War that African Americans actually do fight in the Civil War, and not just for the North, right? So we're going to discuss that as we move forward too. But he makes some really, really important discoveries and discusses this issue at some significant depth in this book. So again, for each week you're going to get from me, these me sort of pointing out, hey, this is a main point you want to get out of this section of the book. This is a main point that we're going to be talking about later on. So just make sure that as you're reading, you when you come across things like, say, a discussion of Thomas Jefferson, that you focus a little bit more. And you maybe don't skim through that section, right? Or when they're talking about territorial expansions, when the big things come up like the Missouri Compromise, that you go a little further in depth in your reading, okay? So I hope these discussions are helpful for you. Again, they're a mix of somewhat lecture, discussing concepts and whatnot, and then also discussing the book and what you really need to get out of the book so you can move forward. So again, I'm really looking forward to this course, and I'll talk with you all next week. Take care.